Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Parents have the God-given right to raise their children, especially when it comes to educating them in accordance with their faith. This fundamental freedom includes the right to know what their children are being taught in school. These foundational rights are reinforced by federal legislation through the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, and the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, PPRA. The bottom line, parental consent is integral to our educational framework. Schools cannot conceal student information from a parent. Schools must recognize this reality. But it comes as no surprise that Democrats want to take away parental rights in education. When parents voice concerns about what their children were being taught during the pandemic, Joe Biden's Department of Justice labeled them as domestic terrorists. Last year, parents in Montgomery County, Maryland, scored a monumental victory when the Supreme Court reaffirmed what we already knew to be true: parents control their children's education. However, many school districts continue to circumvent the Supreme Court's ruling, including my home state of Illinois. For example, Chicago Public Schools featured sex education curriculum beginning in kindergarten. In the first grade, there were lessons on how to define gender identity. In second grade, students were taught the concept of gender stereotypes and how to advocate for change. In fourth grade, the district curriculum utilized a gender snowperson to help students explore the concepts of gender identity, sexual orientation, sex assigned at birth, and gender expression. By fifth grade, there was an introduction to puberty blockers, and students were forced to read Gender Unicorn, learning about sexual orientation and other concepts like gender role stereotypes and gender expression. Students were even expected to define terms like cisgender, non-binary, and transgender. Last year's victory in the Mahmoud case means it's time for these schools to fall in line. My first question is to Mr. Baxter. In your written testimony, you mentioned the role of Congress in protecting parental rights in education, particularly through FERPA and PPRA. Do these laws, as written, sufficiently protect parental rights, or are further protections needed?
They are often ignored by many school districts, and even the Supreme Court's ruling is being ignored by many school districts. So I think Congress's attention to this issue and using its funding mechanisms can be an effective way to protect the rights of parents.
Thank you. What about when schools manipulate FERPA and call it educational outreach when they send student data to left-wing voter registration organizations?
It's a little bit out of my expertise. I'm here to testify on the religious liberty aspects, but hopefully under all of these laws, schools will ensure that all students are treated equally regardless of their religion or irreligion. All students deserve an equal opportunity to be educated.
Yes, and to have their privacy respected, and we are on that. My next question is to Mrs. Parshall-Perry. In your written testimony, you mentioned Justice Kennedy's attempt to assuage concerns of religious freedom violations in light of the Supreme Court's Obergefell ruling. Could you please explain how this ruling was an affront to religious freedom and has set off a domino effect of violations, including the Mahmoud case?
Yes, in fact, Justice Alito himself, in his excoriating dissent to the Obergefell decision in 2015, actually responded to Justice Kennedy's majority opinion and said, this is going to be utilized to stamp out every vestige of religious dissent. And in fact, his words proved to be true. In fact, the Mahmoud decision was made necessary because of individual decisions like the Obergefell decision. Now, we can talk about whether or not it is bad jurisprudence, which I think it is. It divined a constitutional right to same-sex marriage from the same shadowy ether of the 14th Amendment that the court did in Roe versus Wade, and that has been subsequently overturned. And then we can talk about it as a policy prescriptive matter. But I think the fallout is something we cannot ignore. And in fact, as we've seen sort of cultural institutions be overtaken by progressive orthodoxy, we find parents, good, noble, honest parents who simply want their children educated in the crosshairs of a culture war they did not start.
And that's what we want too. Thank you, and I yield back.